Metaversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and I've talked tangentially about guilds in multiple videos already, but I've never done a dedicated video to really give all the details that I'm able to find or even have researched on the matter, so that's what the purpose of this video will be. Because guilds is something that most people kind of are aware of in regards to a medieval setting. We see it often in, say, the Adventurers Guild, but a lot of people seem to not understand the very significant role actual guilds played in medieval history, and so when we adapt it into, fantasy or anything like that, we often can misunderstand or sometimes miss them completely. They're not even present, or we just kind of get them a bit wrong. So the best way to understand what guilds were, how they operate, and how we could adapt them into fantasy, but also just to understand them better, well, let's look to the actual historical period to get a better understanding. That's what the purpose of this video is. So what is a guild, to begin with? It's an association of artisans or merchants who oversee the practice of their craft or trade in a particular area. The earliest types of guilds formed as organizations of tradesmen who belonged to, some type of professional association. This is somewhat similar to a trade union, but they're not exactly the same as a trade union. They're actually kind of a bit of a cross between a trade union and a cartel. The free market didn't fully exist in the medieval period, and so especially with the formation of guilds, because the formation of guilds particularly arose to limit the free practice of a certain type of craft, or just to limit the trade generally, though there were distinct benefits that came from the guild practices. The benefits, but also detriments as well. One of the first things to cover is that they actually weren't always called guilds. The medieval period spanned a very long time and different languages and things, and even though we kind of summarize these are guilds, there were times when they were called legitimately different things. In England, for instance, in certain periods, they were called livery companies. In France, they were called the corps de métier, and I'm really bad at pronouncing French, but it's METIERS. Guilds, for the vast majority, formed in towns and cities. It was very difficult for them to form in areas that were decentralized along the countryside, so it's very rare to find guilds in small village town communities, and in those areas they operated trade more freely. For a guild to form, they sometimes depended on grants of letters or patents from monarchs and other rulers. They then used their position to actually kind of regulate and control the flow of trade to their employed members, and to retain ownership of tools and supplies of materials. But for the most part, guilds were regulated by the city officials. Unless the guilds gained influence and power, which actually was quite common, and in that instance, the guilds themselves became not only part of the city governance, but sometimes ran it. So, benefits and detriments. There was a couple of key fundamental things that a guild first does when it's formed, and it's to determine who can be members. And if you're a member, you then have the right to either practice your trade or craft within their given jurisdiction, and that is usually, as I mentioned, determined by the local governor. By restricting who can actually practice this trade, they actually kind of develop a certain type of monopoly over the given area, because they get to regulate the competition, essentially how many other people will be allowed to trade. One of the reasons that they justified this was to ensure that there was enough demand for the supply. If they allowed too many tradesmen to flood the area, the members of their guild might not have enough customers to make a living. Guilds did also, in certain instances, regulate price control, the minimum price and the maximum price you're allowed to sell the given goods for. They could also regulate the hours of trading, the number of apprentices a given craftsman could employ. And these are just a few examples, because the medieval period, again, very big, very diverse, and so there are different guild practices just based on location that you can find when you really dig into the minutiae here. So I'm trying to give a kind of general representation of what guilds were more commonly like, but if you are wanting to adapt guilds into, say, a fantasy or something like that, you should also understand you have the freedom, like what regulations would a guild possibly put in place? Anything that they felt justified, really. They also had strict standards, though. By having a guild, they would enforce and regulate quality control, something that really couldn't exist apart from general customer satisfaction outside of this. There were also other protections that a guild could offer their members that obviously they wouldn't get if they're outside of the guild. For instance, if one of their members, their tradesmen, got sick, the guild could actually subsidize their wages or even just support them during the time that they're sick. There are often instances of them actually taking care of their members' families. If the tradesman died, they would take care of the widow and family. So you can see some distinct benefits and attractions. Also, by being a member of a guild, it kind of gave you a stamp of approval saying, because you could only be a member if your quality of work was up to this level, so then you could simply say, I'm a member of this guild, to imply your works was up to the appropriate standard and quality level that people would expect. And the guilds would often enforce this quite strictly, even issuing fines to their members when they made work that was substandard, not up to their regulated quality levels. Other benefits also included paying for funeral rites if members died, but also subsidizing travel expenditures as well if guild members needed to move location. You could also see how some of these systems can be abused. If the guilds are now saying only members of our guilds are making the products to the requisite required quality, anyone who's not in the guild could be easily slandered by saying they're not in the guild, so they're not making the quality up to their standard, even if they actually were. And so this could make it really hard for any up-and-coming tradesmen who wanted to practice their craft outside of the guild, almost impossible, because when they gained more influence and control, they legitimately able to bar people from trading within the city flat. And that was separate if they could actually practice the trade. Sometimes they barred it for reasons if they just simply weren't a citizen. But there are other instances, and I'll elaborate this a bit more later, in which a guild would not allow people to practice a craft or even trade within their jurisdiction, such as if they were a woman or being non-Christian. Now, that one in particular isn't a universal. There are many exemptions to that, where there are historical evidence documents of females being members of guilds, okay? So this is the thing, and I reiterate this in Medieval Misconceptions all the time. The medieval period was very diverse place. It also changed over period, and you have such a large area, and so certain practices that were the case in one area wasn't always the case, sometimes rarely was the case in other areas as well. So you can really see some legitimate benefits and problems with the guild system, and they had to tackle with them in the medieval period, like quality control, legitimately good point, but also being prevented from practicing a trade unfairly if you had the skills. Well, they're trying to enforce a monopoly. So you can see there are distinct benefits, but also problems and opportunities for abuse in the guild system, and they existed in the medieval period. And there's even some more complex things that I'll elaborate on a bit later. But I do like that they had very high standards. And remember how I said that they would fine people for selling substandard products? And sometimes they would just full on expel people. So I like the idea of guaranteeing a quality product, because that's what I like. If you find a good quality product, you tend to like to use it a lot. And one of the ways that I personally really like getting a reliance that you can be assured that the product is going to be of good quality is actually, funnily enough, the sponsor of this video, HelloFresh, because the quality of food that they consistently give, I found out, because I used HelloFresh heaps before they were a sponsor. And the reason being, the food was really nutritious and really delicious, consistently so, and so I got that kind of guarantee as a result. One of the key differences, of course, between, say, HelloFresh and a guild system is that you have a lot of options, but it's by comparing the options, which is why I've found them to be of such value. I first tried HelloFresh by using one of their great deals, just like the one I'm able to offer you. All you have to do is go to hellofresh.com and use code Shadowversity16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. Seriously, free food. Very easy to try. I tried it and I was hooked ever since. With calorie smart and carb smart recipes, you can indulge in delicious meals without the worry of it being unhealthy. And it really did help me break out of the recipe rut. I found I was just always defaulting to the same recipes over and over. HelloFresh opened up my family's options to more nutritious and delicious meals. There's also a wide variety of quick and easy recipes, including 20-minute meals, easy cleanup, and low prep options. And on top of all this, they're also very mindful of sustainability. The packaging HelloFresh uses to ship your food is already recycled content. It's really easy to try, you won't be disappointed. All you have to do is go to hellofresh.com and use code Shadowversity16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. The next part that I want to discuss is how common guilds were. They were very common, but not to think that they were necessarily everywhere. But if there was a large city or town, it's a very good chance that a guild system arose, because there were some very distinct benefits, more so for the people at the top, because One of the conditions of being a member of a guild is, of course, paying a certain fee for membership. Now, this could be a type of recurring fee or a percentage of whatever sale you made operating under their authority, being a member of the guild. And as a result, those guilds could end up becoming quite wealthy. But in regards to just the numbers, the way that guilds start usually is in more broader categories, like you would have the trading guild or the merchants guild, where people of many different trades kind of are members of. But the larger the population grows and the more individual craftsmen are required to give the supply to demand. For instance, in a small town, you might only need one local merchant or blacksmith and is doing all their needs. The village might get a bit bigger and you might need a dedicated weapons merchant separate to the blacksmith. You don't necessarily need two weaponsmiths to give all the supply. And so in those instances, if these craftsmen, tradesmen want to form a guild together, the single guild would kind of cover multiple trades. It's when there's a kind of a need for multiple tradesmen in the same job to supply the demand that there is, in which you get kind of more specific subsets of guilds in a given area, where the weaponsmiths might form their own guilds separate to the general blacksmiths. And then that actually increases, so much so to the point where we get some really specific types of guilds organizations just for nail makers, helmet makers, knife makers, sword makers, right? They all had their individual guilds because there was enough individual, say, knife makers to have their own individual guild. But what usually happened when they had many different kind of more specific subsets of guilds, they still kind of operated somewhat together, kind of like an umbrella, where they might have a larger guild hall where all the tradesmen across all the guilds could meet together to do any number of things, because it's interesting. They would plan, set policies for regulations as what defines this practice separate to another guild that might be doing something similar, and so we need to make sure our charters define exactly what's what. But they also got together in types of almost like fraternities, these communities where they're tradesmen in the same craft, and they would hold feasts and sometimes even festivals or stuff just for fun. There's even cases of them holding individual tournaments that only guild members could come to, like an archery tournament, and then they'd have the archery champion of this guild or something like that. And so there was a lot of community around these guilds, separate to the strict kind of overseeing, governing of the trade or craft that they're a part of. As an example of the number of guilds and also how they eventually came more specific, if we look to Paris in France, in the 13th century, there was more than 100 guilds in Paris. But by the 14th century, that rose to more than 350 different guilds just in Paris alone. And they had subsets of guilds even in trades that are very similar, like for instance metalworking. There were subset trades in just metalworking with specific defined guilds in Paris. And these were the farriers, knife makers, sword makers, locksmiths, chain forgers, nail makers, helmet makers, armorers, escutcheon makers, harness makers, and even harness polishers. And so when I said like armorers, like even armorers had subsets for helmets, escutcheon, and just also a separate guild for polishing. And there are even more subsets than the ones I just listed. We have records from Germany. So in Hamburg, they had over 100 guilds, in Cologne, 90 guilds, in Lübeck, 70 guilds. There's a lot of them. Guilds were very common, and they helped frame an essential part of medieval trade and economy. And so if you're going to kind of adapt medieval period to different possible periods, and you want it to accurately reflect what the medieval economy was really like, you really should be putting guilds and try and give them a good representation of what they were like historically, because it's also a great source for conflict and story. And I'll be talking about the classic Adventurers Guild a bit later on, how you could more accurately adapt the historical guilds to an adventuring setting. Even with how common they were, not all city economies were controlled by guilds. They were just very common to be so. When guilds were in control, they helped shape labor, production, and trade practices, and they also tried to define exactly what a certain guild was allowed to make versus another guild. So remember all those specific subcategories where you could have a helmet maker who wasn't necessarily a harness maker, someone who actually made the breastplates or something like that. They probably had the skills to do so, but the guilds made charters, and if you're a member of this specific guild, the Helmet Makers Guild, no, you weren't allowed to make a breastplate that was being made by another guild which had their own members. In some instances, this could actually become quite difficult because there are kind of grey areas, and we see examples of this historically as a result, which can cause a lot of confusion. For instance, what's the difference between a knife and sword, and how big can a knife become before it becomes a sword, and how small can a sword be before it is a knife? There's a lot of grey area there. And so then how did they try and regulate what one guild was allowed to make when it was so similar to what another guild was doing? And we have a really interesting historical kind of point that helps us understand where one of these divisions might have been. And it's specifically on this division between knife making and sword making. And it seems like one of the divisions they made in Germany was by the hilt construction. That if you made a blade with a hilt construction of a knife, knife makers could make it, and if you made a blade with the hilt construction of a sword, it would then be a sword. The reason why we believe this is the case is because there is a certain type of sword that became quite popular in medieval Germany that is called the Messer. Messer literally translates to knife. There is a bladed tool, easily as big as swords, that they legitimately literally called a knife. And anyone who looks at it like, that's not a knife, it's clearly a sword, but it was called a knife and it was sold as a knife. Why? The thing that they were using to define it as a knife was the hilt construction. If you took the same blade and changed the hilt construction so it had a tang that went through the middle of a handle and then was pinned on a pommel to make the hilt construction like that, it would be a sword. Same blade, but now suddenly it's a sword. And it seems like knife makers were legally permitted to make these knives because they were knife makers making them in the way that the charter defined. This is a knife, has to have the hilt construction of a knife, and there might not have been enough definition of the length of blade because there is that grey area. There's almost a crossover area where, is it a knife or is it a sword? It's kind of hard to tell. And then someone might have abused it. Now, medieval people, honestly, even with complex and stupid bureaucracy, they're also pragmatists, okay? And in regards to the lethality of a weapon and everything, who was allowed to carry a certain weapon if it was a sword or knife, they didn't define it by sword or knife, they defined it by blade length. There was actually, in certain instances in Germany, right, I'm talking about because this is where I've been able to get the point of reference and research. I'll go into more detail on this in the Medieval Misconceptions video on the legality of wearing and using swords and just carrying them in everyday life. But when swords were regulated, they usually had a blade hanging on either the town hall or one of the entrances to the city, which defined the maximum length of blade that you were legally allowed to carry into the city, regardless of hilt construction. But there we go. This is just one really interesting example of the difficulties and conflict that could arise in the differences between these guilds when they became so specific. In regards to the power and influence that guilds could achieve, well, when they have more members and they're, trading, making lots of money, and they're paying, a certain amount to their actual guilds, and the guilds are, getting some type of influence in regards to the city, they could gain quite a certain level of power and influence. So much so that it was very common for guilds to have their own coat of arms that defined and, identified them. The coat of arms themselves are usually quite simple and usually had symbols that reflected the type of craft that they were making, whether it was baking or money changing or any number of things. So the coat of arms would reflect it, and we have actual historical either documents or things showing guild coat of arms. With guilds also came designations of skill, because they could now start to regulate it. And this is where we get, apprentice to qualified tradesman, but then after tradesman, you get journeyman to master, and then even grandmaster. And on top of that, certain positions of leaderships in guilds required certain ranks of craftsmanship that you attained, and you might have to actually be a grand master of a given trade to even be considered for roles of leadership in that guild. To move from journeyman to master sometimes was even more regulated than you might think. One practice for attaining the master rank was to go on a 3-year voyage called the journeyman years. And this practice of the journeyman years still exists in certain places in Germany and France. The title journeyman derives from the French word day, day, and it kind of relates to being a day labourer. Journeymen were able to work for other masters, where apprentices were not. Apprentices usually had a fixed master, you worked for them solely until you graduated from being an apprentice. And unlike apprentices, this is where we'll get the difference, a journeyman was paid for their day's labour. Apprentices not necessarily were, hence day labourer, French word for day being jour or journée, bad pronunciation, but hence the title journeyman. So after being employed for several years, an apprentice, if they produced, usually that was like a test piece, is like, are you gonna try and conduct your test to graduate from being a craftsman, and they have to make a specific piece of work that had to meet certain, quality criteria. It would be judged by their master who they're being trained by, and if it passes all the quality checks, the master would grant them the title of journeyman and they graduate. And what's interesting about this, in a guild system, because the master is a member of a guild, he has the authority under the guild to give the stamp of approval to say you are now a journeyman in this guild, they would be given documents as evidence for it. And these documents would be given the authority and weight of the guild that they're a part of, and so instead of just some random thing saying you can do X, it's like, no, this has the weight of the knife makers guild behind it. This man can make the quality up to our standards, and so that means when they travelled to try and seek further employ, they could present these documents as proof and evidence, yeah, I can do the job. A bit similar to university qualifications. So these documents were like certificates, letters from his master or the guild itself saying, yes, they're this rank, they can do this, all that stuff. This is actual further evidence of reading and writing being far more common for the regular person in the medieval period. I've done actually 2 videos, the second one going right into the source, because it's such a foreign thing. I thought medieval people couldn't read and write. Well, there are so many points of evidence to show that actually it was far more common than the stereotype of them being uneducated. And I go through a lot of those in those videos, and here's just another one, okay? If people weren't reading and writing, how could they rely on certificates of qualification when they traveled to different cities to prove where they were? That was obviously common enough that either the journeyman, the actual craftspeople, could read to test. By the way, it's very important for a craftsman and tradesperson to be able to read and write, and also know math to regulate prices and everything like that, to also make supply orders, or any number of things. So really important, reading and writing in the trading and crafting spheres, and this is just another point of evidence. Yeah, much more common than people think, medieval people reading and writing. So after travelling and trading as a journeyman for several number of years, they could then seek qualification to be a master. As I mentioned, sometimes there were specific things that they needed to do, but sometimes there was less. If they could just do produce the product to that level of quality. There are instances of people going straight from apprentice to master in one jump. Of course, that would require approval from the master themselves or the guild heads. And to go up in qualification, sometimes it also required a donation of money or other goods. And there's interesting practice, because sometimes this was actually not needed if you were the son of an existing guild member. And also in relation to the possible donation, you would need to produce a piece, a master-crafted product, which would then illustrate and prove your capability in the craft. And this was often retained by the guilds themselves, sometimes even put on display. Now, even with the more specific separation of guilds, I did mention how they often would still associate forming larger guild halls, and sometimes these guild halls became the actual location of the city's governance. For example, London's guild hall became the seat of the court of the Common Council of the City of London. In many German and Italian cities, the more powerful guilds often had considerable political influence, and sometimes even went so far to attempt to control city authorities and government. In certain instances in the 14th century, this actually led to bloodshed, during which guilds outright went to dissolve town councils and detain the members of those councils, so basically the city government, to increase their own influence. Guilds sometimes enforced biased practices. In the 14th century in northeast Germany, people of Wendish Slavic origin were not allowed to join some guilds. Some were even restricted. I mentioned that they would sometimes restrict the practice of women and non-Christians. A bit more on the women thing a bit later. Because in contrast to this, but aligned with the instances of conflict, there were certain guilds denounced by the Catholic clergy. And they did this for their conjurations in 858. West Frankian bishop Hincmer So he basically tried to bring more Christian practices into the guild practices, to not great success. But he preached against their binding oaths sworn amongst themselves to support one another in adversity. That was not necessarily a bad thing, but when it's only in this group to the exclusion of other groups, and not helping or using your resources to help the general people, that could be seen as a bit of a negative. There were also instances of them conspiring to kill specific enemies, and also back one another in certain feuds and other ventures and things. And so there's just interesting machinations. The whole actual medieval guild system is so interesting. I went out of my way to incorporate many aspects of it in my novel, Shadow of the Conqueror, because it is so interesting. Their influence in government, the power that they can attain, and also the problems existed, and so much so that there are key characters that have very strong history with guilds in my book, and they have effects in the story because there is rife opportunity for additional conflict. So with guilds and their inclination to gain more power if they were capable of it, we see instances in the medieval period of the rising of greater guilds, because when certain guilds gained more influence and power, it wasn't a universal thing. They weren't purposely going out of the way to lift all the other guilds with them. Usually it would be only the guilds within their close group, or just their guilds themselves, and there were competition and rivalry between different guilds. And as a result, there were certain guilds that gained so much power that they were considered greater guilds, and all the other guilds that didn't have as much power influence were looked down. They're the lesser guilds. And so we see this kind of division of greater guilds and lesser guilds. Not in every instance, but in the instances where guilds did gain a lot of power, this kind of dichotomy also rose. Greater guilds, lesser guilds. The trades that more commonly were able to rise to the status of being a greater guild were the wool, silk, money changers guild, with less often the doctors and druggist guilds, and the furriers guild. Less cases, but it did happen with them as well. The guilds more commonly being in the lesser category was, say, like the saddle makers, the bakers guild, iron workers, and other artisans specifically. In many instances, the lesser guilds still had very sizable membership and were still very wealthy, but they didn't have as much social influence in the local government. In Florence, Italy, there were 7 to 12 greater guilds and 14 lesser guilds. The most important of the greater guilds were for the judges and notaries, who handled the legal businesses of all other guilds and often served as arbiters in disputes. And so you can kind of see how they would be able to rise to being the greater guilds if they're actually taking a role of officiating disputes and other things like that. So medieval guilds did limit women's participation, but usually only to the widows and daughters of known masters. So if they were a widow or daughter of a known master, even in cases where women's roles were restricted, there would be exceptions, and the widows and daughters would be allowed to practice the trade and even be members of the guilds themselves. But not in every instance. You have to understand, again, such a broad thing, so many different things happening in period and location. There's exceptions and differences just on region and time period. So much so that there's actually multiple accounts of women's participations in guilds in England and on the continent. In the study, London Silk Woman of the 15th Century by Maria K. Dale, she notes that medieval women could inherit property, belong to guilds, manage estates, and run the family businesses if widowed. The Book of Trade of Paris documents that 5 out of the 110 Parisian guilds were female monopolies, and that only a few guilds systematically excluded women. Only a few. Some other professions were also open to women: surgeons, glassblowers, chainmail forgers. Now, it's interesting because chainmail doesn't require huge amounts of muscle. It's often working with wire and lots of winding and things. Entertainment guilds also had a significant number of women members. And as I've already mentioned, there were cases when women were denied, being able to practice trade and stuff. So to say that women's rights were universally bad or universally much better than other historical periods in the medieval period, it's not a blanket statement. You can't say that. It very much depends on location and period, and if you're wanting to adapt the medieval period more accurately, you can have a bit of freedom as to what you think the dynamics could be. And so with all the things that we've gone through, I hope we can really see how interesting and also kind of complex and diverse the whole guild system was in the medieval period. And when you're wanting to adapt it in fantasy, there are so many inspiration sources that you can look to, and I'll focus kind of on one, that idea of the Adventurers Guild. Now, the first thing that I would want to frame this around is my previous video on the very idea of the fantasy adventurer and how likely they would be in a more kind of accurate medieval setting. Doesn't have to be fully accurate, but just if you're drawing inspiration from medieval history, what would the adventure really look like? And with those conclusions that I came to in that video, really encourage you to go watch it. There is the question I rose in that video: would there be enough adventurers to even warrant the actual role of the adventurer? Would that be a common task? And there were some takeaways, like what if they were the local heroes? And if there was enough kind of influence and power, I could see a group of adventurers, maybe the local heroes, to form guilds to regulate the practice of adventuring in the local area, especially if there were problems with murder hobos, basically, the crazy adventurers and stuff like that. There might be a certain type of regulation that wants to be instituted. One of the tricky things is, and this is going to lead to a different video that I want to do, is the fact that adventuring very much is related to the military protection. There's a lot of fighting involved. And when it comes to the practice of the military in a medieval setting, that was more often state-associated, more decentralized as a medieval feudal setting, but the lord would often be running the kind of local military to help protect the area, and it would be more rare for just the random adventurer to just do it on his own free will, and there would be an interesting interplay between the state authority protecting and fighting monsters versus the local heroes, the random adventurer just wants to do it because he's got the skills and ability to it. And that then would greatly influence the possibility or the way in which an adventuring guild might appear. But you could certainly incorporate certain historical elements that we talked about in an adventuring guild system, where to actually operate as an adventurer, I like to kill monsters and everything like that, or to help things, you need to go to the local adventuring guilds to get their permission to even do it. And if you did it without their permission, well, you could have the actual adventuring guild coming after you. You could employ it in a fantasy setting in a really fun, interesting way. Like if you have a D&D setting and everything, what if you actually have to earn membership in the adventuring guild? And that could be becoming an apprentice or proving your worth in a certain quest, something like that, and you get certain benefits, access to certain craftsmen, magical items, who knows, if you're a member of the adventuring guild. It could also help the adventurers in certain ways, subsidize travel, like, we see instances in the medieval period. If they get sick, look after the family and widows if they die. There would be very specific benefits that I could see adventurers kind of getting together and wanting to support one another in their profession, if the profession is warranted based on the setting. Again, go check out that video, what would medieval adventurers be like? Because again, if you want to pattern the adventuring guild, more closely after the historical period, we wouldn't just have a blanket adventuring guild. Remember how they became more specific when there was more members and specific roles? And so what would also be more common is that an adventuring guild might end up splitting between combative and magic based, and then it could split again to specific the Rangers Guild versus the Fighters Guild, the Rogues Guild, the Mages Guild, Sorcerers Guild, and you could even split it further than that to specific the Monster Hunting Adventurers, or any number of things by role, occupation, with perhaps an overarching authority of the adventuring guilds collective, or they could be separate rivals. There are interesting things that you could look at historically and then switch up the stereotypical blanket, it's an adventuring guild kind of thing. So there are lots of opportunities for interesting, fun things that you could explore. And there we go, the medieval guild system. Really interesting topic. I hope you have enjoyed, or perhaps even learnt something. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I look forward to reading them, and of course, I look forward to seeing you here on the next video on Chatterversity. So until that time, farewell.